Hello, and welcome to Great Decisions for February 28th, 2022. This is week 4 of our program. Tonight's lecture is the Quad Alliance with Dr. Marty Farrell. Tim wasn't able to be with us tonight, but I will do my best in his stead. My name is Tony, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to take a moment to also thank our sponsors, without whom this program would not be possible. The League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and the Lakeshore Pax Christi. Now, if any time during the presentation you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the comments, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. All right, now allow me to formally introduce you to tonight's presenter. Marty Farrell was born in Winona, Minnesota, and graduated from Winona Senior High School. He earned his BA in Political Science from DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana, and his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago in International Relations and Political Science, respectively. He is a veteran of 44 years of college and university teachings, his last 40 of which at Ripon College. The author of over 50 peer-reviewed works, he led student and alumni study abroad experiences 8 times and has personally studied and done research in 45 countries on 5 continents. He has served as a fellow of the East-West Center of the University of Hawaii, president of the North Central Council of Latin Americanists, and executive director of the Wisconsin Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, which named him Peace Educator of the Year in 2015. At Ripon, he also co-directed an international film series, which brought over 700 international films to Ripon campus. In terms of public service, Marty has served on the City of Ripon Police and Fire Commission and has represented the City of Ripon on the Fond du Lac County Board of Supervisors since 1994, and is currently in his 15th year as board chair. Dr. Farrell, thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony. I appreciate the nice introduction. We'll go to the PowerPoint now. First, though, I would like to thank everyone there in Manitowoc, the various groups that are sponsoring the Great Decisions series, everyone at the library. I think this is about the 16th year I've done this, and I always enjoy coming over there in person and meeting with the folks, the sponsors, and also seeing all of you in person. We're just not practical to do that this year, so we will do it remotely. And just one other addendum to the introduction. After 28 years on the Fond du Lac County Board and 16 years as chair, I will be stepping away from that service as of this April. I felt, after that amount of time and about 6,000 trips back and forth between Ripon and Fond du Lac, among other things, that was probably time for me to give somebody else a chance. So I will be stepping down from that. But otherwise, I continue to be active in my scholarship and trying to keep up on affairs that are pertinent to areas of expertise that I might have. And that's true this evening with China and the Quad. So let's take a look at that. And we look at the first slide. The term bandwagoning is not used too frequently, but the idea is getting on the bandwagon. Often you hear of it in campaigns, a campaign bandwagon, but in international relations, it's used when countries cooperate together, frankly, often in opposition to a perceived common adversary or enemy. And in this case, as the symbolism indicates, that would be China. And the Quad itself, we'll take a look at this. You'll see sometimes it's referred to as an alliance, but of course it actually isn't an alliance. It is a security dialogue consisting at this time of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. So again, it's just something that they are getting together for mutual security concerns, other concerns. If you look at the right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see that there are two alliances involved, and that is between the United States and Japan, and the United States and Australia, also New Zealand. In that ANZUS alliance, these date back to 1951, so right at the beginning of the Cold War era. Excuse me, the other parties, India does not have a formal treaty relationship, but in the Quad is beginning to work toward a security partnership. So the origins of the Quad can be traced back to the Indian Ocean tsunami back in 2004. This was when Prime Minister Abe of Japan, in the wake of this disaster that killed up to 250,000 people across 14 countries, suggested that these four countries get together and coordinate a joint national natural disaster response. At that time, Prime Minister Abe, who's pictured there, envisioned this advancing, becoming closer cooperation in a number of different areas. And initially, there was interest by the other parties. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll see, though, that in 2007, the first informal meeting took place between those four countries. And in September of that year, military exercises called the Malabar exercise involved for the first time Australia, as well as India, Japan, the US, and Singapore. And this is also where another aspect of the title does come into play, and that is Indo-Pacific. So we have heard of the United States taking a pivot toward Asia and possibly towards East Asia, concerns about South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan. But with the term Indo-Pacific and with the military exercises named Malabar, we see the security area that is under consideration expanded to include the Indian Ocean. And that is a big change in focus. It's a new sort of broadened focus, but also it obviously is designed to bring in India, as we'll see, as a very significant partner in these efforts. However, the first iteration of the Quad did not really persist at this time. Prime Minister Abe resigned in 2007. Our slide here tells us that Quad critic Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister of Australia and gradually brought Australia out. Interestingly, if you read the article in the Great Decisions Handbook, which actually was written by Kevin Rudd, he denies that. He denies that he's the one that edged Australia away. He said his predecessor, John Howard, was very sensitive to Australia's very extensive economic ties with China, which we'll see are very significant, and they've been very advantageous to Australia. They have sold a tremendous amount of goods to China over these many years of China's economic growth. The United States also was much more preoccupied by Middle East and counterterrorism at the time. So by 2008, this arrangement, the Quad 1.0, atrophied on the vine and kind of fell out of the picture. But by 2017, Shinzo Abe was returned to office as prime minister he had actually been returned as early as 2012, but he began to advance another revival of the Quad in 2017, and a meeting took place in Manila, Philippines, to advance this. And once again, Australia joined the Malabar naval exercises in the Indian Ocean after more than a decade away in 2020. Quad meetings met virtually in 2021, and the first in-person meeting of the Quad Alliance took place in September of last year. Some of the impetus for reviving the Quad, again, one of them certainly was this bloody Sino-Indian border clashes in the spring of 2020. So you may remember hearing about these. These took place in the Kashmir area that is disputed between China and India, also between India and Pakistan. If you look at the slide carefully, you see the Pangong Lake area. It's a very desolate area, but nevertheless, it's being fought over between India and China, and the fact that this burst into actual casualties with India getting about 20 deaths is something that reawakened India's interest in cooperating, with the Quad. And so that was part of the impetus to go for 2.0. In these meetings, both in March and later in September, the spirit of the Quad was enunciated in communiques. There are varying descriptions of what it is. Simple consultative talks, or a new maritime security partnership. Are they perhaps also stakeholders for a free and open Indo-Pacific? A counter to Chinese potential aggression in the Western Pacific, and possibly a building block for a regional or even a global anti-Chinese alliance. And that is certainly the way the Chinese have come to view it. Initially, the Chinese did not take it very seriously. They did not think that the four powers involved could really cooperate very well. Too many conflicting interests. But as things advanced in last year, in 2021, China began to take it very seriously indeed. And so if you take a look on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that there's a very rudimentary rendition of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. We'll see a more detailed one of that in a moment. But this can be seen, this Quad security dialogue among the four nations, as indeed somewhat of a counter to that in the Indo-Pacific, Indian Ocean, and Western Pacific. So you see Japan, US, Australia, and India portrayed here. Korea is linked in. South Korea is not a member of the Quad at this time. There's been some discussion that they might possibly join. Then it becomes the Quint at 5 rather than 4. But as of right now, that has not happened. Korea has some other concerns, wants to maintain better relationship with China, does not want to antagonize China, wants China's cooperation in keeping North Korea under some kind of semblance of control. So that may be something, though, in the future, and it would certainly add a formidable military component, since Korea is a very formidable, South Korea, a very formidable economic as well as military power. That communique, the spirit of the Quad, speaks of striving for a region. Let's no, not don't let's don't advance yet. Let's go. Yeah, thank you. Strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, anchored by democratic values and unconstrained by coercion. They aim at facilitating collaboration, including maritime security, meeting challenges to rule-based maritime order. They want a rule-based maritime order in the East and South China Seas, not a power-based, a rule-based maritime order, not just a power-based one. But this is, of course, what we also have wanted in Europe. And of course, this whole discussion takes place in the shadow of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the very stark defiance that represents of a rule-based order. So we will refer back to that and as part of the context of this, because it does change some of the considerations, that we have when we look at China's possible actions in the Western Pacific, that the Quad grouping is designed to at least try to meet that challenge. Now, it is not simply military or security interests that the Quad has. They also, again, originally it was a natural disaster relief effort that brought them together after the 2004 tsunami. But at this time, a joint vaccine distribution initiative was also a very high priority. The Quad members pledged 1 billion doses of vaccine to be distributed to a number of countries in that region. They also have a climate change study group. They also have concerns, obviously, about cybersecurity and making technology supply chains secure. So again, if you see those Quad readouts, all those various phrases, these are all different phrases associated with the Quad. And yes, a number of them are military or security oriented, but others are not as well. So it's a broad gauged effort to try to provide a vision for the whole Indo-Pacific area. Okay, now we could advance, if you will. Again, looking just at the geostrategic position of China here, as Robert Kaplan has written a few years ago, that with its very large continental mass and huge population, its climatic and topographical variation, and 9,000-mile coastline adjacent to the main shipping lanes of the Pacific, China occupies the world's most advantageous position geostrategically. So that is quite something to contemplate at this point in history. And for most of its history, making use of those things, China was a dominant power based on its superiority in population, in wealth, in military power, in governance. It wasn't democratic, but it usually had effective central government from the time of the Qin dynasty unification of 221 BC right up until that system's demise in 1911. And China was a leader in technological innovation over so much of that time. Joseph Needham was able to put together almost 30 volumes just looking at Chinese science and technology, including silk, porcelain, paper, printing, magnetic compass, crossbow, gunpowder, exploding cannonball, landmines, rudder, horse collar, blast furnace, cast iron, kites, noodles, lottery, and even toilet paper. Although I think right now they're using a lot of Kimberly-Clark products. All right, if we can move on to the next slide, though, we see that China at a certain point, did decline. Up until around the late 18th century, China, but also India, were the world leaders in manufacturing, especially if you're looking mainly at textiles, which were the main manufactured item at that time. China and India led the world in textile production for centuries. And how did they do that? They did it because they had more workers. It was really a matter of population. And actually, if you look at Western political theorists such as Adam Smith, or even before that, John Locke, they both commented very directly that wealth is going to mainly be determined by the number of workers you have, not the amount of land that you have. China happened to have both. India had both. But when the Industrial Revolution came along, suddenly an English worker in even those rudimentary factories could produce thousands of times as much textile output as this similar worker in China or India. And this is what propelled first England, then the Netherlands, then the continental countries in Europe way ahead of China. China, again, we know from that superiority that they had for several centuries. Most of the gold and silver that was plundered by the Spanish and the Portuguese from the Americas, yes, it went through Spain and Portugal and other European countries, but most of it ended up in India and especially China. And then, of course, during the Opium Wars, that silver was milked out of China again by the British, demanding hard currency as silver and gold for the introduction of opium. So without the Industrial Revolution, China faded, and it was a big loser in war after war after war, starting with the Opium Wars of the 1830s and 40s, Sino-French War, Sino-Japanese War of the late 19th century, and later in 31 of this past century, Japan invaded China and occupied much of the country for several years and committing atrocities, continuing until the end of World War II in 1945. And that, of course, was followed by the Chinese Civil War, with the communists being victorious in 1949, with Kuomintang leadership retreating to the island of Taiwan. So if we could go to the next slide. Just a very brief overview of Chinese foreign policy, aligned with the Soviet bloc from 49 until 60, although that alliance began to split as early as 1956 with Khrushchev's de-Stalinization speech. Mao didn't like that, and they began to move away. 1960 through 72, China had a revolutionary foreign policy articulated by Lin Biao, and actually came very close to war. Shots were fired around the Ussuri River northern boundary between China and the Soviet Union. Out and out, all-on war was avoided, but at that time, China had been isolated. It was alienated from the Western powers, including the United States. Now it's alienated from the Soviet Union. So in 1972, Mao decided reconciliation with the United States made geostrategic sense. And that's Henry Kissinger and then Nixon's visit, finally culminating with full diplomatic recognition. From 1978 to the present, this we refer to as the reform era, during which China opened itself up to the world, which it hadn't under Mao, and became one of the preeminent manufacturing and trading nations, and joining the World Trade Organization in 2002. And China's tremendous economic growth during this reform period is what makes it a power to be reckoned with again for the first time in over 200 years. If we go to the next slide, again, just very briefly, some of you may have seen these in the past in other talks, but we see on the left-hand side that in the 1950s and 60s, China really wasn't growing much, but with farm privatization and the establishment of special economic zones in the late 70s, we see an economic takeoff, which really then accelerates in the 90s and up into the 2000s. And then on the right-hand side, really has continued and has, yes, it has slowed down somewhat in recent years, but still has outstripped the growth of those other countries and other indices that are indicated there. This is what makes China a power to be reckoned with now. When I first went to China myself personally in 1981, they had a lot of revolutionary rhetoric and they had a few nuclear weapons. That is true. But really, they had no ability to project power, either hard or soft. And if they were attacked, they had a massive army that could resist an invasion, as they resisted NATO forces in the Korean War, or I should say United Nations forces in the Korean War. But still, they were not that formidable a threat. But with this economic growth, with at least the world's second largest economy, now China definitely is something to be reckoned with. So I would like to then move to the next slide and see a few quotes that have proved to be true, which is even back as far as Napoleon, 1817, let China sleep. When she wakes, she will shake the world. Sign in the Pentagon during the Cold War, if we ever faced a real enemy, we'd be in deep trouble. That was saying that the Soviet Union wasn't a very formidable enemy because their economy was so inefficient and really was really quite pathetic. But just contrast the Chinese economic juggernaut that has produced consumer goods as well as military hardware, whereas Soviet Union had to really strain every possible system to try to keep up militarily. Henry Kissinger in 2015 said, remembering China in 1971, if anyone had then shown me a picture of Beijing today, I would have said it's absolutely impossible. Kevin Rudd, again, we mentioned earlier, China's economic explosion is like the Industrial Revolution and the global information revolution, combusting simultaneously and compressed into not into 300 years, but 30. That is about, we have never seen such rapid economic and social transformation. And Lee Kuan Yew, the late Prime Minister of Singapore, points out it is not possible to pretend that this is just another big player. This is the biggest player in the history of the world. So this is what makes them formidable. And in the photographs, you see the Pudong area on the top picture, nothing there in the 1980s, early 1990s, and now today, a huge city of over 5 million people and a modernistic city. This actually helps China militarily as well, because they are able to, as they build their military, it is largely being built from scratch. That means they can utilize the most advanced systems and aren't piggybacking on obsolete systems inherited sometimes with vested interests from the past. If we move to the next slide, China likes to tell us that they want a peaceful rise, that they are trying to, overcome their national humiliation and return to predominance that they enjoyed earlier in their area. They want to reestablish control over territories of Greater China, including not only Xinjiang, which they are controlling brutally at this time, as well as Tibet, also brutally, and Hong Kong, which has been recently cracked down on in a way that I'm going to comment on later, Macau, but eventually Taiwan. They aim to recover their historic sphere of influence along their borders and in the adjacent seas, so that others give it the deference that great nations have always had, and command the respect of other great powers in the councils of the world. Those are their aims. But as John Mearsheimer pointed out already over 20 years ago, China, if it continues to grow economically anywhere near the rate it had in the 80s, has the potential to be more powerful than even the United States. It might be far more powerful and dangerous than any of the potential hegemons that the US confronted in the 20th century. Nazi Germany, Soviet Union. A wealthy China would not be a status quo power, but an aggressive state determined to achieve regional hegemony. The US must reverse course and abandon its policy of constructive engagement before it is too late. And that was the warning of John Mearsheimer already back in 2001. But China, we'll move to the next slide, and we'll see that, again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you get the PowerPoint, which I certainly will be happy to give permission for, you can take a look. But they've been using their economic growth and prowess as a kind of eco-strategic initiatives through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is the largest investment bank in the world in terms of assets. $130 billion larger than all 6 Western development banks. The well-known Belt and Road Initiative, 900 infrastructure projects linking 65 countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa, but also with initiatives into Latin America, equaling 12 Marshall Plans in inflation-adjusted dollars. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership very recently, and this includes Japan and South Korea, along with the Southeast Asian nations, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So trying to co-opt all of these countries, even though they may have maritime disputes with them, into economic codependency. Bilateral trade agreements with 40 African nations, leading to an increase in trade with Africa from 10 billion to 200 billion in just 16 years. And again, I mentioned new agreements with 16 Latin American and Caribbean countries with expanded trade, as well as Chinese loans and grants for physical and digital infrastructure development. If we go to the next slide, again, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this is a schematic presentation of the Belt and Road Initiative, railroads, pipelines, gas pipelines, but also digital, fiber optic cable, but also coordinating standards among all these different countries so that they can communicate directly and effectively. And so this is enormously ambitious and obviously has power implications for Chinese influence. They're using their tremendous economic growth to expand their influence. So let's look at the next one. Doesn't mean there aren't problems. This isn't our main topic for tonight, so I can't go into all of these. There have been some bumps along the Silk Road. So not everything is going always smoothly, but still it is very much underway and it is producing results, not always 100% effective, but nevertheless, it is proceeding. Go to the next slide. For instance, again, here's where the Quad has run into some difficulties in the past, because a country like Australia is so heavily dependent economically on China, but it's not the only one. Japan is as well, the United States is as well, but Australia is just probably the most obvious example, as you see here, that China, for instance, imports 40% of all of its, China imports 40% of the products that Australia exports to the whole world. Of all of everything Australia sends out, 40% of it goes to China, and it's a growing amount, whereas the others on there are actually decreasing or maybe staying the same. And Australia's 10 biggest trading partners, obviously China is by far the biggest. If we could go to the next slide, now we get down to the very serious disputes here. So let us take a look at these. China's claim is on the map, as you can see here, is the red line, and it's obviously by far the most expansive claims in the East and South China Sea. Obviously Taiwan, which they consider a renegade province, and they say that inevitably that is going to have to be returned to Chinese control. But the Chinese claim here is called the 7-dash line. And it is interesting that this actually is not just unique to the Chinese communist regime. That same claim was made by the nationalist regime that was in power from shortly after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 up to their defeat by the communists in 1949. So it is true that the nationalists also are had made this kind of claim, and it's based just on tradition. But that is not the acceptable sort of claim from today's perspective of the International Law of the Sea Treaty. So if you look at the other countries' claims here, you can see that most of them are just claiming their exclusive economic zone that they are entitled to by the Law of the Sea Convention, 200 nautical miles, and it follows more or less the contour of the coastline. And this is what the other countries are claiming. Now, it looks like Vietnam has a bit more expansive claim as well. But for present purposes, China's claim really has not stood up. But there's a tremendous amount of at stake here. It's even though these are mainly uninhabited islands, there is a large amount of natural gas, petroleum, but also the shipping lanes are extremely important. China has actually put military equipment on some of these small islands. They've even built up, I believe it's 3,200 acres of land. They have actually brought in earth and built up tiny little specks of land in these Paracel and Spratly Island areas, and are using those as footholds for their claim to the 7-dash line. Again, as these claims are adjudicated, China almost always loses. But on the other hand, again, that presupposes a rule-based system that we are going to follow the international law of the sea treaties and the national exclusive economic zones of 200 nautical miles established by that convention. But if China is not going to follow that or obey the rules, that then is what presents a great deal of concern. So this is one of the main areas of concern that the Quad countries have. It's not the only one, but it's one of the major ones, along with Taiwan. So if we go to the next slide, is the Quad a good counterpoise to Chinese aims, whether it be in the East China Sea, South China Sea, or toward Taiwan? Well, if you look at it in the aggregate, the Quad, obviously has some things going for it. With India as well as the United States, and Japan, we have a quarter of the entire world's population, 1.8 billion people. Also, a little over a quarter of the world's economic activity. Quarter of all global foreign direct investment flows comes from Quad countries, and they held a foreign direct investment stock in 2018 of 8.7 trillion, $1 for every four. So it's really about a quarter of the world in most of these significant measures, and a lot more than China, as you see economically. They're at least looking at GDP. If we can go to the next slide, we also see even militarily, we are looking at, again, the number of ships. If you combine Japan, not all of American ships, but just the U.S. 7th Fleet, which is the one assigned to the Western Pacific. But India's naval forces and those of Australia, it does exceed the naval forces, the combined naval power of China. And so, and also in terms of defense spending, it looks like, you know, the US is more than double per year that of China. And then you add in India, Japan, Australia, and again, it's considerably more. So it looks as if on paper, looking at these things, the Quad could be a significant counterpoise to Chinese power, even just in the Indo-Pacific area. However, that can be a little bit misleading for a number of reasons. And so if we go to the next slide, part of the problem is that China's concerns, if we go back to the Robert Kaplan map that we looked at a while ago, China's primary concerns, at least in the maritime sense, are right in its, you know, backyard. It's just right there on its Pacific coastline. Whereas here, the tyranny of distance. So the United States, yes, we have the 7th Fleet, which could be there, but to add to that but even Guam, which is one of our major bases there in the Western Pacific, is 3 to 5 days for warships to get into the South China Sea from Australia, 1,900 miles. Even Tokyo, 1,700. It's much further than, whereas China's right there. China's about 100 miles. The coast of China is about 100 miles off the coast of Taiwan. That's all. So it is right in their backyard. And the other point is, these other countries have a lot of other things to worry about. And China, yes, also has those Western provinces to worry about, unrest in those provinces, which I mentioned, it's putting down all too brutally in recent years. But that is not requiring a lot of military resources, you know, to be coldly efficient about it. It's not a tremendous drain on their resources. They can focus. This is the main point. China can focus their efforts on that Pacific coast. And they have every reason to do so, because as we saw, starting with the British in the early 19th century, for over 180 years, all the big threats to China's security and all the wars that it lost so disastrously, they all came at China from that direction, from the sea and from the east, whether it was Japan or the UK or France before, in the earlier wars that they disastrously lost. So this is why China has some really major advantages here. Their main concern is right there off their coast, very close, and this is what their main security concern is. Whereas the other countries are spread much more thinly. The United States, we have over 370 bases all around the world. I don't need to tell you that we have concerns in Europe. Right now, we're obviously and rightly preoccupied with what's going on in Eastern Europe. We have spent 20 years in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, $6.4 trillion fighting what was portrayed as a war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. Spent 20 years focusing on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. Whatever skills we picked up, and I hate to say it, this does not reflect the brave men and women who served there and in many cases paid the ultimate price for it. I support them in their efforts 100%. But I wonder how much of what we learned there was, number one, even effective, but number two, how is it going to help us against more conventional adventurers like Russia right now in Ukraine, or China possibly in the East China or South China Sea? So we are spread out, and we have not been focusing on the same thing. China has been focusing, laser focused, to use a cliche, on that Western Pacific coastal area. And that is what we have to concern ourselves with now at the present time and into the future. Okay, let's go to the next one. A lot of detail here, but what I would like to first of all mainly emphasize on this chart is the dotted line there called the first island chain. So China has what they call A2 anti-access. They wish to keep U.S. and Western forces out of that first island chain. If you go back to 1996, there was a Taiwan Strait crisis under the Clinton administration. At that time, the Taiwanese president, Lee Teng-hui, came to the United States, which China didn't like, and spoke at Cornell University. So China started firing some missiles, not at Taiwan, but over or near Taiwan. At that time, President Bill Clinton responded with the biggest display of military might from the United States in Asia since World War II, or at least Vietnam. 2 aircraft carrier groups plus assault ships. China had to admit it couldn't come close to competing with our maritime military might at that time. But at the same time, that's when they said, we have to change this. We have to start investing. And that's what they've done. That's 1996. So that's, well over 25 years ago. And that at that time, China's defense spending was 1/30 that of the United States. It now appears to be at least a quarter, but it might actually be closer to a third or even a half for reasons I'll get into in just a moment. Another incident you may remember was April 1st, 2001, when a U.S. intelligence plane collided with a Chinese J-8 fighter off Hainan Island, which is down in the lower left-hand side there. It was actually very close to, Chinese airspace at the time, our intelligence surveillance plane. It apparently killed the Chinese pilot, and our plane did not suffer casualties. It did crash land on Hainan Island, which is only 100 miles from the Paracel Islands you can see down there. And so it's very close to some of the disputed areas right now. But this is what China is determined not to allow to happen. That is, they just are not willing to have foreign countries constantly bumping up against their own airspace. And so that's why they're trying to create this first island chain and deny access to hostile powers within that. But that also includes Taiwan, as you can see. Now, the more ambitious goal is to deny access to the second island chain. That goes all the way out in terms of as far as Guam and as well as Japan. So that would be a more ambitious goal by the Chinese. If we go to the next slide, we do see here how the United States might counter some of this, might respond to a Chinese attack, but it would be difficult. And this is where help from the other Quad countries, as well as a number of the regional powers in Southeast Asia, would also be helpful. So we have strategies for trying to deal with a Chinese attack on Taiwan or on some other sovereign countries in the area, but it still would be difficult. And the problem is that China could possibly achieve its objectives within days, while it takes us weeks to get our forces in position to actually do something about it. And so that is why this is kind of a perilous situation. And so then I would like to look at the next slide, if we could. This looks at, again, this is a few years old. They haven't updated this at the RAND Corporation recently, but the trends are what I would point out here. Looking at the left-hand column, a Taiwan potential conflict, the right hand, a Spratly Island potential conflict. The dark green box gives the U.S. major advantage, but as the color gets more lighter green, yellow, orange, or into red, the U.S. is at a major disadvantage, or China is at a major advantage. And if you just look at the trend from 1996 to 2017, the trend is in the direction of more advantage. Still not an overwhelming advantage, but more advantageous to China, both in the case of Taiwan and in the case of a Spratly Islands conflict. If we can move to the next slide. This is what the situation is projected to be as of 2025. Now, this does not include on the blue or right-hand side. This is just U.S. forces in the region. This does not include Quad forces if they were able to be brought into the picture. So it is limited in that sense. But if we look at this, it doesn't look too favorable for the U.S. because the Chinese, as we said, have been building and building and building. And that is quite a formidable force that we are now confronted with, and that they can concentrate on that first island chain and that second island chain, because that is what they consider their vital interest to be. Graham Allison, who's a veteran scholar, and I'm going to refer you to a study that he just very recently published, December of just this past year, a few months ago, for the Belfer Center at Harvard. But as he said, facing the situation realistically, the path between a realistic recognition of the facts and succumbing to alarmist hype is narrow. In other words, it'd be very easy to see this and panic because it doesn't look good. And I have to add to this, our military conducts war games exercises, and they do it trying to see what would happen. This is one theater where we do it. And again, unfortunately, we have to do it in a number of other theaters as well, because we are, at least now, assume worldwide responsibilities. And we have interests in Europe, obviously. We have interests in the Middle East, but we also have interests in Asia. But we're confronting a very serious adversary in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And this is where the Quad, I have said, is an effort. And again, we looked at the aggregate statistics, population, economics, military forces. The Quad on paper is pretty impressive, but they've never coordinated themselves in any kind of an actual military effort. They also are not located, Japan is, but the others are not located right in this particular area. We have other responsibilities. So it's a very, I just don't know whether the Quad is enough. And in my conclusion, you'll see, I say it may be too little too late. Maybe you shouldn't have had that hiatus of 10 years when the Quad wasn't being looked at, but of course there were reasons for that. But the other thing I would emphasize here is that China may be getting more bang for their buck in terms of their military spending, than we are. And there are several reasons for that. One is that the purchasing power is greater in China. So if you even look at the Economist and their Big Mac index For the money we spend on one Big Mac in China, for the same exact amount of money, you get 1.5 Big Macs. And it's the same for military procurement. They are able to get similar equipment at a somewhat lower price because labor is still cheaper in China. And that even actually applies to their soldiers and sailors. The total cost of an American one soldier is estimated at about $100,000 a year. And that does include veterans benefits, but also just maintenance, pay, what's needed to keep a soldier in the field. $100,000, they need only 28,000. So there are some, that narrows the gap in terms of defense spending because they're getting more bang for the buck, both in terms of equipment and in terms of the human power that's involved. Another issue is that China has built this all up just in the last 20 years, 25 years, so they can take advantage of the most modern technology, whereas the United States, for both technological but also political reasons, we tend to be wedded to some systems that we liked in the past but may not be up to date and may be too hard to modernize. And so one way that we can make this even more specific is to say that, again, if you look at what China has here, especially all the missiles down at the bottom, they have a very projectile-oriented or projectile-centric force. And our current national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, has said that it's quite possible that we have made huge mistakes because we are so oriented toward aircraft carriers and big boats and things of that nature. Jake Sullivan said recently, for every $10,000 we, the United States, spend on an aircraft carrier, the Chinese spend $1 on a missile that can destroy that aircraft carrier. And of course, the other thing that the Chinese are placing tremendous emphasis on is cyber warfare and the ability through the satellites and other communications technology at the very top of the chart to knock out our command and control. And so if that is effective and if that is successful, that obviously hampers our ability to counter anything that the Chinese choose to do in this particular area. So again, I am not saying this to induce panic. The world is maybe going to be a different place because of Russia's recent actions in Ukraine. If they get away with it, I hate to say this, but it might embolden somebody like China to make a move on Taiwan. Obviously, I do not want to see that. They have said they won't do that as long as Taiwan doesn't declare independence or try to escape from what China believes is its correct place as part of Chinese territory. But on the other hand, we have to look realistically at Hong Kong and what happened there in 2020, where China clearly violated its agreement from 1997 of one country, two systems. The idea in Hong Kong was Chinese government promised that if you join China and become part of our sovereignty, you can keep the system that you've had for 50 years. But yet that system has now been dismantled with the new security laws. And so they went back. They did not honor that promise. So how is Taiwan supposed to believe that China would honor the very same promise that they have made to Taiwan? I don't see how you could. So that is pessimistic. On the other hand, if Russia can be shown to pay a very heavy price for what they are doing, that may restore some support for the rule-based order, which is what they're violating. That's what they're violating. The rule-based order says you don't invade other countries and try to capture their territory. And so if this can be rebuffed in an effective way, or if the price paid is sufficiently high, then that might encourage Beijing to show more respect for a rule-based order and concentrate on the common interests that they do have. There's a very strong economic interest between China and all of these other countries. And of course, a lot of that would be destroyed in the face of an all-out conflict or war, whether it be over Taiwan or the Spratly or Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. So with that, I think we can go to the last slide. And so this is my conclusion. The Quad has a lot of promise in and of itself. It might be too little too late. It may be that they should have not taken that 10-year hiatus. They should have continued to concentrate their efforts. But it's too late really for us to say that at this time. But I do think that their multi-pronged approach, which is not strictly military, but also natural disaster relief, the vaccination programs, emphasis on a rule-based order, ecological concerns, global warming programs, all of these things are excellent things for the 4 Quad nations to be participating in. But whether it's going to be sufficient to counter what China has been doing in the meantime remains very much an open question. All right, thank you very much. So that, I think, hopefully we have a little time for questions.
Yes.
If there are any, I'd be happy to try to address them.
All right, we'll jump to the comments. This is from Mark. What effect could the latest developments with Russia have on China? Nina Khrushcheva recently wrote that Russia is the likely loser in the recent Xi-Putin agreement. She goes on to say that China is unlikely to back Russia in any confrontation with the West over Ukraine, and that if Russia is isolated from the West due to this conflict, China will gladly exploit China with abandon. Your thoughts?
Well, that's a complicated one. I'll be honest with you. That's a difficult one to answer. To me, it's disturbing that Vladimir Putin recently said, and this is obviously before the buildup around Ukraine, that Russian-Chinese relations have never been better. And if that is something that encourages Russia to count on Chinese support for what they are doing, that's very unfortunate. Nations, again, I quoted John Mearsheimer earlier, nations are going to follow what they perceive their own self-interest to be and their own national interests. This is what they're going to pursue, whether it's helpful to us or not. But China, on the other hand, also, is very strongly opposed to anybody interfering with what they term national sovereignty. And so that is obviously what has happened in Ukraine. So it's my understanding that China did vote in the Security Council to condemn the Russian invasion, whereas India, a member of the Quad, did not. Now, why does India not want to condemn Russian aggression in Ukraine? India does not want to condemn it for 2 reasons. One, India, going back all the way to its early independence, has sought to be non-aligned nation. I'm aware so is Switzerland, but Switzerland is apparently taking a stand, economic sanctions against Russia. But India also, they have tried to count on Russia as someone that supports them. And India's number 1 enemy is Pakistan. And so they have tried to cultivate Russian support in their struggles against Pakistan. So it's a complex world out there, but what I think we really have to try to somehow uh, make sure that Russia and China don't team up together, because that could be very difficult. And for me to hear Putin say that Chinese-Russian relations have never been better, that is not what I want to hear. That's about the best I can do on that very difficult, admittedly complex and difficult question.
All right. We have another one here from John. Any comments on the procurement of U.S. submarines over the French-built subs?
Yes, that's a very good point. I had that in my notes. I was going to refer to that. Let me see if I can find. But essentially, you may well remember that, as our questioner does, that Australia, and this was part of the Quad discussions and agreements, that Australia canceled a deal with France for, I believe, 8 or 10 diesel-powered submarines, and instead said, we're going to buy nuclear-powered submarines from the United States. And this was favorable from the U.S. viewpoint, not only because, we'd be selling them the propulsion systems for the submarines, but strategically, these are a better counter to China in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Nuclear submarines are going to be more effective. They can stay down a lot longer, a lot harder to detect. It's just strategically an upgrade for the Quad. So this was something that was good for the Quad, but not good for France. And France violently objected to this, and even recalled their ambassador to Australia, which is a pretty strong measure. So what I would say about that is a very good point, because, and it was in my notes, I just didn't work it in right now, but thanks to your excellent question, that was the reason. If people are just reading the headlines, or hearing something here or there, and say, gee, why did Australia do that? Was that just a favor for the United States? No, that's very much tied into everything that I've been talking about tonight. That's very much tied into the Quad cooperating together more and trying to have more and better military equipment to counter possible Chinese initiatives in that area, in that Indo-Pacific area.
All right. Well, it looks like we've reached the end of the questions. Just want to say again, thank you to Dr. Martin Farrell for joining us tonight. We appreciate you stopping by and informing us on this intriguing topic. If you have more interest in Great Decisions or any of our lectures, we still have our books available at. Oh, it looks like we got another question. I will pop that on up quick for you. Let's do this. Okay. Another one from John. We have declined to sign the TTP in 2017, and that has followed by China making a trade agreement with its neighbors. What would have happened if we would have signed the TTP? Get this one in quick.
Yes, I understand the question, and my answer is an emphatic. Well, I guess the answer is yes, in the sense that I believe we should have joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The whole point of that was to exclude China and reduce China's economic influence in that Indo-Pacific area. Because of all the, I believe, 14 or so member nations, China was not to be one of them. And it was a way to lower tariffs and increase trade. And I realized we had a president at the time that, in my opinion, did not understand foreign trade, and he called himself the tariff king. He didn't see an advantage in lowering tariffs, but it also had, that agreement had environmental considerations, global warming considerations, worker protection considerations. That was kind of a model trade agreement, if you understand that trade basically is good. And it was going to, a way for the US and other major, again, some of the Quad powers to reduce China's economic influence, which, as I pointed out, is a major part of their forward strategy with Belt and Road Initiative and all those other ones we discussed. Now, there is a replacement organization called CPTPP, but China has now applied for membership, filling the vacuum that is there because we didn't join, as the questioner has suggested. So yes, if you, again, we need a multi-pronged approach, and we need to improve our military approaches in ways that I mentioned. We have to realize that this incredible amount of attention we paid to counterterrorism after 9/11, was that really the right way to go at that time, to that tremendous extent of $6.4 trillion and 20 years of military focus? But we also need to counter China's economic offensives, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership was actually an excellent way to do that. And now, since we're not in, China is trying to step in and add it to its arsenal, as opposed to something we could have used to advance our interests. So, emphatically, that was a big mistake.
Okay. Well, we got time. We'll just do one more final question before we wrap it up for tonight. Another one from John. So Pakistan allowed India to send trucks over their territory to Afghanistan carrying wheat. How positive should we feel about this?
That one I'm not too aware of. Is it possible to ask what time period? When did this happen? Was this while we were fighting in Afghanistan or since we left? My feeling about it is different. Because I don't think it's, again, I don't think there's too much dispute about this, but Pakistan was not really helping us when we were involved in Afghanistan. And so if they were allowing wheat to go from India into Afghanistan, it probably was to help the Taliban, not to help our government.
John commented that it happened last week.
Excuse me?
He commented that it happened last week.
Just last week?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, now that's a different situation. I think that's a positive. To me, that would be a positive sign, and I was not aware of that. So I appreciate that being brought to my attention. I'll look into it.
Okay.
But from what I can tell right now, look, the Afghanistani people, the Afghans, have suffered way too much already. And now if they have a government that can't organize an economy, and we're going to have rampant starvation just on humanitarian grounds, I'm happy to see somebody try to help them. So if India and Pakistan can get along better, then maybe India can devote more attention to China and to the other objectives that the Quad is trying to work on. And, that would be a good thing.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate that. And thank you for your comments and for your views. Please join us for next week. I'm sure to be a very important one with Russia and the U.S. with Dr. Lowell Barrington. All right. Everybody have a good evening, and thank you for coming for Great Decisions.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Tony.